It's super hard to not put yourself in their shoes. And if you don't put yourself in their shoes, you will never come to that sweet spot of like, okay, something needs to be done. Where do we start? I understand your problems. I understand what we can do. Where do we meet somewhere in the middle and start that journey?
Welcome back, everybody. Rich Rubiker, founder of Collective Responsibility, here today with another episode of the Sustainable Ambassador Podcast. Through this podcast, I'm speaking with global sustainability leaders in corporate, non-government, government, academic spheres about the work they're doing to solve the challenges that we face in our communities, outside our window, in our environment, in our economies. And through this episode, I'm extremely excited to be joined by Pritha Hariram, who is the iPAC Director for Water Infrastructure and Climate Adaptation at Ramboll. She's an experienced environmental engineer with over 22 years of experience in the management of urban water systems to safeguard public health and build resilience to climate change. And for me, this is where we're bringing a couple of topics together over the last year around water as well as around finance. And, she has an incredible career, so it's going to be a great conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. So, Pritha, thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you very much, Richard. Very happy to be here as well. Thank you.
Great. So, as a starting point, it'd be great to hear a little about you and the work that you're doing over there.
So myself, Pritha Hariram, I've been in the water sector for over 23 years. I'm currently the head and the director of water and climate adaptation for Ramboll in APAC, based in Singapore. My career has taken me several places over these 23 years globally. I have lived and worked in several countries, starting in Australia, Asia Pacific, and in Europe. My formal background is I'm an environmental scientist and engineer. I started my career in this sector in Australia after graduating from university. And a huge part of my focus is on urban and water resilience, building solutions, driving in innovation to really make our water resilient in an ever-changing climate. But more than half of that journey has been working in the finance sector, really unlocking that finance across that value chain to really bring water supply and sanitation for all in the region.
So, what was the start of the journey? What got you into water to begin with? What got you into sustainability as a career?
Yeah, I would say the career has been rather accidental in terms of water, and sticking to this path. But my educational background was, I wouldn't say accidental, it was very much deliberate. I studied environmental science and engineering in Australia, and that pivoted a career in this sector quite differently as well. I actually started my career outside Australia as a young graduate, working in post-conflict, back then known as East Timor, but officially now known as Timor-Leste. And it was providing drinking water and sanitation services in rural communities in an area where there was no infrastructure. So it was a dream for an engineer who had just, finished everything in a lab environment and not knowing how to practically apply it.
So, what is the size and scope of the global water crisis as you see it? I mean, this is a huge topic. I'm sure you spent hours on it, but if you were to kind of compress it into what you've experienced and what you spend your time looking at, what is the size and scope of the global water crisis within the work that you're doing these days?
We could determine size in different forms and formats, right? I mean, if you want to talk about financially what this means, we're talking in the trillions. And this is not just global, I'm just talking Asia Pacific. And that staggers from large infrastructure that is required to service communities for basic drinking water, sanitation. But then as if you really want to put size with climate challenges and impact and the need for adapting, water is the risk for climate. If you want to talk big, we can talk big. We can even talk about populations that are going to be impacted. We're talking about 3 to 2 billion people on this planet who are currently affected as well. So there's portions within that numbers that's affected by just not having access to clean, safe drinking water or sanitation services. And then those who will be impacted in the near future, even we're talking in months, in years, from climate-related impacts of droughts and floods, that is all in the center of water. And when we're talking, we're just not talking about people's houses being washed away or loss of lives. We're also talking about economic downturn. Everything we do today needs water. Um, it's multifaceted. It's giganimous in terms of numbers. It's also really huge in how do we keep up with the innovations and bring that in. And there is a point of convergence. Um, and it's really exciting times. Yeah.
One of the things I kind of go back to is that I never view, particularly in Asia, water wars as being, say, between states. Although I know that there are some states that, that they're having some direct political challenges over, say, damming of water upstream, downstream. For me, it was always about the cities against the farms and who will get the water. You have the farmers who largely draw off the water for free to supply food to the country, to the region, and that is one major draw of water. But the other one is the energy sector, primarily feeding cities, be it manufacturing or light bulbs and the lights in our cities, and that tends to be one of the heaviest draws. And what I've seen in China is particularly is like there's this back and forth between who's going to have access and how much it's going to cost, and okay, we're going to import water from other regions. I'm curious, how many people do you think understand this in a sense? Because it's so pervasive. It does feed into your energy bill, into your water bill directly, into your food. Like it's a daily thing that if there's too much of it, it ruins your farm and your housing. If there's too little of it, everything is very expensive. And I'm curious, like having spent 23 years, like do you think that we fully understand like the implications of water and then how climate will be impacting its availability, pricing, and who gets access to it?
In terms of the impact, I don't think anyone who's sitting there is kidding themselves saying that this is not an issue. Even when we are sitting with clients, they know the challenges. They know what it means in terms of the impact. And there's so much of information about it. Not only information, Richard, we see it every day. The next big monsoonal rainfall, the next typhoon to hit Philippines, people are living with it every day, and they have not been living with it every day just yesterday. It has been many years. Just the frequency is becoming more. So the understanding behind the science of it is becoming higher on the agenda. As you're aware, I sit in Singapore, and the commitment on coastal protection and flooding is super high on the agenda. Agencies that typically work around this here in this nation are pivoting in terms of driving that agenda, thinking of what is priority. So I would not say that people don't know. Capacities could be of a different range, especially now that you want to accelerate innovation, the way of thinking and planning, which, by the way, has been there for a long time. So if you talk about integration and holistic planning, it has been there. But now, today, we're seeing it more on the ground.
Okay, so but is it the crises like Philippines having 7 typhoons last year that's driving awareness? Is it the cost that's driving, like the cost of water going up that's driving awareness? Like, what are the major drivers? And then how does that support, say, more resources being allocated by governments or by local agencies to deploy the solutions? Because I feel like you always have priorities, you always have budget constraints, but now it seems like there's definitely a much more of a greater priority towards this. Is that driven by the economics of water or the crises that we're seeing? Like what drives that in your experience and what the conversations are that you're having now?
It is crisis, right? Sadly, that really brings. But then what now we're seeing, as you just clearly highlighted, it's the frequency. It's becoming every other day in some places. There is a tipping point in resilience as well, right? There is a tipping point in terms of how long do you keep losing your asset and just building again, losing, building. There is, a tipping point. You can't do that physically, you can't do that financially. And people are becoming, as you said, more aware themselves because you are access to information. It's on your fingertips. So they are taking a more targeted, a championing step within their and are pushing for this, right? So I think people are starting to recognize it's no more just a public issue. It is also my issue. How do I lean in to do this differently? So it's really getting up on the agenda, but it has pivoted the way how we look at finance. It has pivoted the way how we look at solutioning, designing, programming, structuring progress. It has definitely, and there are some really, really good examples. Now it's time for scale.
How do you see the financial end of this coming together? Because it is a very large bill. There's a lot of countries that require and cities that require more infrastructure and require more technologies to come in. Where does that come from?
So typically, of course, in the water sector, it has been very public, right? So, but what we're seeing today is the leaning in of the private sector. So we're talking also industries, right? There are big industries, big consumers of water who are taking a forefront step in what we would deem as water stewardship, but water stewardship on steroids, huh? Because there's water stewardship where you do something for corporate social responsibility, and then you do water stewardship for the basin level that you are operating in. And we are seeing that, but it's not one person's responsibility. And I think that's where the difficulty in all honesty, it is everyone's role. So until that commitment is built into that individual sector, that hey, we're all competing for the same resource, we all have a role to play here. It is always going to be a challenge to funnel. And I mean I'm sure, Richard, you've spoken to several people in the finance sector. The common thing they always would say, the finance is there, the money is there. We need what they call the bankable projects. They call it. And then when you start unlocking what that each of them define, it's so different. So if you're trying to do that, then you're like, okay, so where do I get funding for this particular one? How do I aggregate? So I mean, I do have to say also the financial community has come a long way. They're sitting at the table.
I want to get back to the idea that everyone has a role to play here. And I'd actually like for you to just talk about the work that you are doing. What is the APAC Director of Water Infrastructure and Climate Adaptation doing? Who do you interface with? What are you trying to get done? Like, are you trying to make the business case? Are you trying to drive investment? Are you trying to engage stakeholders to understand like why it's so important? Like, what do you do? And from there, we'll talk about like how you got into the space as well.
It's not cookie cutter work that we do, right? Especially when we're talking about water resilience, climate adaptation, which is the core of the work we do here in Asia Pacific in Ramboll Water. And as part of climate adaptation is twofold. One is mitigating some of those impacts, protecting ourselves from it. So it's the flood resilience, the drought proofing. Plus then the resilience part of it is how do we advance technology in terms of treatment, in terms of infrastructure for industries. It's not just one, it's not just sitting behind and designing and coming up with innovative designs or technology. It is that stakeholder engagement. It's sitting there with your client and looking at the long-term view. Generally, typically consultancies have worked by contract in, contract out, contract in, contract out, billable hours, a fee, a profitability. But at the same time, you got to be prepared to take that long-term journey. So the long-term journey is building that partnership with your client. So no longer you can do it as like, oh, here's a contract, just do what I've asked you to do, because it's also our responsibility. If you know that something is not perhaps going to be as resilient if we do it this way, it is your duty of care to have that conversation with your client, and take them through that journey. So it is very much spending that time, having that journey. As I said, these clients, they know the issue, right? But sometimes because they're pulled on every direction, you're the one who needs to kind of like take that bigger stand and have that patience to say, it's okay, we'll talk about it again. But I understand we have this issue now. So let's unlock that first, but let's work towards a roadmap. The joy that we get is being outside and actually coining these partnerships, building the relationship with our clients to really bring those solutions. Because a lot of the solutions cannot be just done behind closed door either. it is that community engagement, it is that stakeholder engagement, and I think that's where a lot of us get our drive.
And who are your clients? Do they tend to be, say, government, municipalities? Are they corporate, mix of both?
So our portfolio would be a mix of municipalities, state governments, public utilities, um, private developers, master developers, um, and industries who all have a similar challenge. Yeah, sorry.
Would you say that, like, if just generically speaking, that your public, say, municipalities, the utilities, the national governments, like, that their interests are often more aligned than, say, what corporate interests are? Is there a complete separation between, like, the private need between industry and, say, like what they need to draw off of and what they're going to use and what they're willing to do against, say, the public? Or do you actually see a lot of alignment happening now, like you mentioned the basin earlier, like where actually the private realizes like their interests are completely aligned and they need to be more responsive to the public need?
Um, when you speak to them individually, it might sound very diverging, but when you bring them together, there are a lot of commonalities, and if you can bring that together is when we can unlock. So public sector is thinking about their citizens, is thinking about the capex costs that they will always need to keep throwing on the table. Whereas the private sector is it's bottom line, right? It's commercial, right? So ensuring that they can continue to operate, they can continue to bring in the financing that they require to grow as a company. So it's still, I wouldn't like to say the word individualistic, because they would argue that whatever they're manufacturing or whatever they're doing is for users and beneficiaries, which is the same people. But the drivers are a little bit different, but the challenges and the issues that they're dealing with is the same. So then how do you really find that sweet spot that then, kind of allows them both to be happy in their tandem? But what we're seeing more and more is both this private sector and the public sector coming together. Gone are the days where you would find an industry just finding land, starting to build, whether they take from the grid or they don't, but they actually now are having an active conversation because they are aware of their risks a bit better. But however, I feel that even understanding your risk should be more than just reporting on it. It should be really understanding it, and not many people, I guess not many industries are aware of how they can, and I believe practitioners like us have a role to play in at least telling them what that is.
Well, on that note, like you've been at this for 23 years, you've worked in nonprofit, multilateral, corporate, and now consulting. What is it that keeps you involved in this space? Like, why is this your career? And maybe what are some lessons you're learning along the way through each? Like, do you kind of enjoy each one but very differently? Or do you long to go back to nonprofit after seeing that? Like, how do you view your career and what keeps you going?
It's a good question. I have been also reflecting a little bit on that myself over the past few months and years. And I think what really drives me is I need to know at all times that I'm adding value. But while I'm adding value, I myself need to learn. And learning is various aspects. It's not I need to sit with the guru in this area to learn from. I'm so humbled to learn from the team that I work with, who are either in their early stage of their career, their mid-career, the way they think, the way they solution, how agile they are in just using, software or AI is something that I have learned from, and I'm continuing to learn. And I think as long as I have that balance, I keep going. The reason why I also have moved around is combination. It's one for personal reasons, when you have family and commitments, you tend to move around. But I really wanted to understand that value chain, and that value chain of the entity that is servicing these people, so the public side, whether it's utility or government, where is the money flowing from? Multilaterals, DFI, so looking at both the sovereign and the non-sovereign way of lending, how that ticks. How does an investment banker even talk about water versus an economist in the Asian Development Bank? How do solutions really can be practical? And that was also one of the reasons I took that change from being in the financing side from development financial institutions to saying no, because I kept seeing these amazing practical solutions that consultants were putting on the table, high-end consultants. And are truly not about the bottom line. It's about that sustainability, that drive. And Ramboll is definitely one of those companies among a few who only look at sustainability and for society, and which ticks the box for me. But it's how do you translate those amazing solutions, which you cannot implement immediately today because of these challenges we were talking on the client side or on the city side, and how to bridge that gap, the ability to listen, to understand, and facilitate. Yeah, I guess you could just say I'm a facilitator or a glorified facilitator, but thank God somewhere along the lines I made sure I got formal education to understand the basics of the 101 of engineering, to even kind of, raise an eyebrow when someone says something funky, going, I don't know. But at the same time, really being humbled on the challenges each of these people face. Because I like to understand that, right? Because it's so hard to, when you're having a conversation and arguing, right? It's super hard to not put yourself in their shoes. And if you don't put yourself in their shoes, you will never come to that sweet spot of like, okay, something needs to be done. Where do we start? I understand your problems. I understand what we can do. Where do we meet somewhere in the middle and start that journey?
Well, oftentimes I'm talking to particularly like young professionals or like students coming into the market. I'll say either go work for a nonprofit or go work for a consulting firm. Both of them, hopefully, in the right position, will give you the ability to understand the broader picture of what's actually happening, but from the ground's perspective. Sometimes consultants, obviously, you're flying around a little bit more, so you're not quite seeing. But nonprofits, you're seeing it on the ground, and you tend to be a little bit more advocacy oriented. Where consulting, you try and be a little bit more analytical and find that sweet spot. Kind of, you start off more on the nonprofit side, and now you're in consulting side. Are you glad that you started a nonprofit, or do you think you should have started consulting? Like, if you look at the two now and you think about your career trajectory, how did starting in a nonprofit help set you up for your career? And do you think that nonprofit's a good place to start, or would you recommend more of a consulting for the business oriented? Like, that start is so critical. What's your thoughts on nonprofit versus consulting as a starting point?
It's really tough, right? Because today's generation ticks very differently. They study one thing, they do something so different, right? They really, really follow their heart and their passion. I might sound like a old grandma if I say this, though, but I believe if you are coming out of a professional um, educational background like engineering, and you really want to work in that area, I highly recommend getting some of that formal design practical experience. And I'm not saying you can't get that in non-consultancy too. You can be sitting at even the public side and doing this, right? Because you have resident engineers as well. So that it doesn't really matter where. I think what's really important in today's career is you find a workplace that also respects you for who you are when you start. That's only what's going to make you tick and keep going. And so far, everywhere that I've been has been a dream journey, because I've just been able to work with amazing people.
Last question. If you were speaking to a aspiring student or a young professional, what are 2 or 3 tips you'd give them to consider as they build their career in the water space? Like, what are 2 or 3 things they could either pick up, showcase, focus on that help get them a little bit further ahead?
Be curious. Don't ever think twice to ask a question, silly or not it might sound. So always be curious. Lean in, roll up your sleeves and just do anything and everything. That's the only way you will learn. It's a luxury to say like, oh, that's all I want to do. Don't do that, because you actually miss out on an opportunity to learn something and and be agile. Build a solid skill set on yourself, right? So, like if you are an engineer, spend that time doing some of these designs and understanding it. I sometimes hear that one, oh, I've been doing this for 2 years. I'm bored now. I know it all, right? There's no such thing as know it all. I don't know it all. Like, even in by being curious and wanting to learn just allows you to be a much more rounded person as well. Because it's not about just yourself. It's when you're sitting at these, when you end up in a career like myself or anyone in my position, you have to take the bigger stand and really understand where others are coming from.
Okay, I'm going to follow with that with one more. If you're starting your career, or like I guess in your early years, how important was it to be out in the field and kind of really understanding the roots of the problem, the people that are involved, be it, the actual end users that you are working with, but also the government officials, the financiers, like really day to day working with your hands on the issue. Because I find like a lot of consultants, they can be a bit apart from it. They can be in their office a little bit too long, a little too much PowerPoint. But how much of that early experience of being on the ground helps you throughout your career or through the work that you're doing now as a consultant?
Super, super important. I strongly believe I'm where I am today because of that. I did wear the hard hat. I spent those 12 hours on the field in the hot sun, um, challenging situations, really looking at it and hearing people is so, so important. And as you're right, I don't think it's just only in the early career. It's also, I have also been in situations working with peers who've never set foot and they're building the policy and the frameworks around it. I'm like, okay, how are you planning to do that? Or you want to do business in Asia, but you're sitting in Europe. And I'm like, I'm sorry, you know, you need to be you need to be where it is. And your clients and the partners and the peers you work with here are demanding that, right? This is also a relationship business, the water sector, not only the water sector, but consulting, anything. It is a relationship. People need to look you in the eye or at least get that sense to just also build that trust because you have to build trust among each other, among peers. We work in consortia with multiple consultants. Arguably, we could all say, my design is better than yours. But when we come into a consortia, we just have to look at each other and believe and trust that there is going to be fair play on the game, right? So that comes with a bit of physical presence. Yeah.